Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security advisor, national security lawyer, and as well as human rights lawyer, and as well as renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight, in the world, according to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. Always glad to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Same here, Irina. So lots of big stories today, Irina. And lots of meetings. To Trump and Putin meeting tomorrow. Putin expected to be in India. India, Modi expected to be in Washington. Maybe some reports are saying that. I want to understand what is this all international diplomacy, international friendship. Why I call this is, Modi calls Putin friend, Trump's called Putin friend, and then different levels of friendships are happening. But friends are not listening. Putin is not listening to Trump, and Donald Trump is not listening to Modi, and the tariffs and all that. So first, let's touch about the India position itself on the India-Russia pivot. 50% tariff expected to come into force later this month, but India is this making India move more towards Russia? How does this whole scenario look like sitting from there where you are, Irina, in Washington D.C.?
Well, this happened as actually a direct result of Trump imposing an additional 25% tariff on top of the 25% tariff that he already put on India, supposedly as secondary sanctions for buying Russian oil. All of that is very dubious, given that China instead got a postponement of additional tariffs on top of the 30% that it was getting, another 90 days of a break for negotiations. Most likely it was less about the Russian oil than about Trump trying to, on the one hand, message to his base that he is supposedly fighting for U.S. interests in this matter, but also because he has far more leverage with India, which is much more dependent on the U.S. Economy than with China, which is a big investor in the U.S. and an exceptionally high tariff could lead to job losses on top of what we've already been experiencing here. So all of this is not surprising. The fact is, Trump is inadvertently or perhaps deliberately pushing India into Russia's and China's orbit. Essentially, while the talks with India over defense purchases continue, rather than offering an opportunity to buy U.S. oil at a lower cost, Trump is creating a zero-sum situation where India has no incentive to continue cooperating with the U.S. because Prime Minister Modi is being put in a position where he has to come out very strong, very nationalist, looking like he's not taking Trump's attacks and without a response. So all of that may explain the strange message given about calling Putin a friend right after Putin attacked civilian hubs again, killed a number of small children, and India has been distancing itself from Putin, not just on the issue of oil, but also on many other fronts. And this sudden use of the word friend, while it incensed many Ukrainians, was probably message not so much to Zelensky as it was to Trump. And essentially, India's message here is that it can it has other opportunities. It can return to old alliances very quickly, and we are seeing that also in the social media. Indian accounts are reverting to the praise for historic ties between Russia and India, for its support for India's sovereignty during while it was still the Soviet Union, and we are seeing that in other words, India is recalibrating its strategic equations. This talk with Putin, this message with Putin, is also a sign of things to come. And by that I mean Putin's upcoming visit to India later this year. Behind closed doors, uh, Modi and Putin are likely discussing safeguards such as energy flows, potential long-term contracts, and even exploration of new supply chains and corridors. In fact, far from pushing India away from Russia, this is leading to potential plans for to further deepen cooperation in sectors like defense, nuclear energy, and pharmaceuticals, which are being heavily tariffed by the U.S., but are quite needed in Russia. Let's face it, economically, India's reliance on Russian crude, which is basically up to a third of its daily imports, cannot be instantly replaced. Middle Eastern, or even US alternatives pose logistical, pricing, and compatibility challenges for existing refineries, forcing a pragmatic path forward. But let's face it, India was increasingly buying Middle Eastern and US oil already, both as part of agreements and recalibration and diversification strategy, and also because of the broader sanctions and caps related to buying Russian oil. And also, the Russian oil has also been going up in price independently of all these things. Uh, Modi is in a position that he has to juggle internal pressures as well. There are still ongoing widespread farmer protests over perceived economic subjugations. Some of them are based in real internal tensions. India is a very big country with a lot of different demographic issues, a lot of different social issues, but also Russia has been behind similar protests in Europe, and it could be using the real economic situation to its advantage to keep India from moving too far away into a sphere of complete economic independence. There are also national narratives about sovereignty, the political cost of appearing to blink in a standoff with the US, and we have seen that the tariffs have already triggered effigy burnings and public outrage across agricultural heartlands because the agricultural sector is being very heavily affected by the tariffs and very quickly as well. On the global stage, these developments are not simply a bilateral spat. They're signaling the fragility of the US India camaraderie built under the Quad or broad Indo Pacific strategy. There are talks that one or both of the leaders could skip the next Quad meeting, which would be a very strong signal for China to assert itself. India's misreading of Trump's transactional diplomacy has handed space to Russia to reassert itself as a strategic partner. Now, I'm not saying that India completely misread Trump. I think actually there was a fairly pragmatic attitude towards it, but I think they underestimated how far Trump was willing to go. He allegedly did not coordinate this new he basically just randomly called it out in a press conference, announced it without any coordination whatsoever. So there was no expectation of additional pressure from New Delhi. Still, the Indian leadership sees value in maintaining ties with Washington on geostrategic priorities, including regional stability, climate, technology. Trade ministers are still engaging. There were rumors that some of the defense trade talks were cancelled. That was not true. And UN meetings are looming as potential venues for overtures and discrete resets. The shock of this whole thing came as a surprise to many Americans as well, outside Trump's closest circles, who was privy to his thinking. Now, economists are warning that prolonged tariff pressure could erode India's competitive edge, especially if global companies are hesitating to invest due to tariff unpredictability, and Trump has been completely unpredictable in that regard. Others are saying that India's growing domestic market and diversification into pharmaceuticals and digital services also has been growing for a while, could cushion the blow. In the meantime, Modi is looking to visit China, which becomes more than just face to face diplomacy. It's a rethinking of regional equations. India is trying to signal autonomy in a very high stake realignment and refusing to be cornered in a bipolar world, especially under the circumstances that the US cannot be relied to maintain close ties. All of this could redefine India's 21st century foreign policy arc, not choosing between Russia or the US, but asserting and doubling down on strategic autonomy, even in the face of economic erosion. Whether that holds or fractures under pressure is the question now on the table. And of course, a lot of it is also contributing to the strengthening of BRICS, which was fairly ineffectual until recently, but the trade volume has grown, especially since Trump started imposing those tariffs.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So where does this look like? Is it why do I get a feeling this is all brinkmanship by different parties, and it's all going to be finally down to trade and business later on? Because you see, Trump and Putin are also meeting. Suppose if Trump and Putin agree on something, then will Trump immediately change position on Russia? And does that mean it will also lead to changing position on India? Why would Trump, knowingly make it things so obvious and so volatile for people who could be of use for them, for countries who could be useful for them, especially vis-a-vis its long-term plan of disentangling from China? How does this all look like? Is it a planned sort of an acting from that administration down there, or is it a much more bigger show of brinkmanship and actually fighting for the for better deal for his country?
No, there is a lot of brinksmanship. It's true. It's Trump's traditional style, and it's very likely that he's threatening India with these extremely high tariffs, the highest in Asia, higher than China, just in an effort to create a shock that will then create a space for a negotiation and to a more moderate position. He hopes that it will deal a blow to India's economy and force India into a compromised position. For instance, as I've mentioned previously, there have been disagreements and impasse over particular industries, some of the tariffs on India's side, and so forth. Trump thinks that India could be forced to come to a better deal with the United States. Now, now the overarching strategy here is that Trump thought he could create an effective trade triangle between Russia and India against China. That doesn't seem to be working out very well. First of all, US dependency on China is far greater than he cares to admit, and we have seen that he's done a number of compromises to China. TikTok lifeline keeps getting extended. Taiwan president and defense officials were banned, and defense talks were cancelled. US agreed to sell AI semiconductors, advanced ones, to China so long as Trump gets a 15% cut from the companies. All of these things are actually strengthening China's hand. None of that screams a strategy to limit China's economic or security reach. So I don't know whether this original uh, idea of creating this alliance with Russia and India against China is a real thing. Whether Trump recalibrated after seeing that China and Russia cannot be easily split up, or whether he actually does not really care about any of the so-called rivalries, but is just seeing what he can get out of various parties at the at the lowest cost to his own image. And for now, India seems to be the easiest target. And with Russia, he wants to come to, and he has always wanted to come to both economic deals for the US, but also deals related to the Trump organization, which he has not divested from. Now,
Absolutely. Right. Carry on. Carry on.
all of that being said, this actual upcoming summit in Alaska is not necessarily an example of any great strategy. It was sort of organized hastily and as a result of a, believe it or not, miscommunication by Witkoff, who misunderstood Putin's comments regarding a land swap, which he thought entailed some sort of a compromise by Russia, but in reality, Russia was demanding a full cessation of strategic occupied territories in Ukraine in exchange for freezing the conflict. None of that came even close to what US was expecting. Trump initially stated that he hopes to get a ceasefire out of the summit. He even considered bringing Zelensky in, but ultimately decided to only talk to Zelensky and two European leaders um, on the phone. So, in that sense, this particular summit was not necessarily some strategic visit. I think it was an accident which Trump tried to use an opportunity. Now, reportedly, he is willing to offer access to Alaskan rare earth minerals and natural resources to Russia in exchange for peace, whatever that means. Whether peace means a full withdrawal or freezing the conflict also remains unclear. Freezing the conflict means that Russia can restart it at any time. Gaining access to minerals in Alaska is likely to be an insufficient incentive because Russia does not just care about natural resources, it has plenty of them at home, but it also cares about strategic territory and nationalist and imperialist narratives, and essentially having a strategic military position. All of those things matters, although for the Russians, gaining access to Alaska strategically would put them also right on U.S. Soil and provide them with greater access to intelligence, equipment, economic opportunities, and so forth. Still, it's probably most likely not enough to compensate for their loss in the event they were to withdraw from Ukraine altogether. So
Absolutely.
we are seeing all of these things play out, and there doesn't seem to be a clear plan. We have seen Trump vacillate a lot on the expected outcome of that meeting. He has tried to downplay the expected outcomes and present the summit as exploratory rather than a final peace discussion. Clearly, he is going to try to pressure Ukraine into land cessation of some sort. That said, he cannot enforce it other than simply putting pressure on Ukraine by denying it access to weapons, which he had proposed via European countries paying for them, which would lead to more civilian losses and would make him also look bad. So there's no clear exit strategy for Trump out of the corner, where he and Witkoff's inexperience in this arena have painted him. I think the best. I think Putin is already getting a major diplomatic win simply by being allowed to visit the United States after being accused of being a war criminal and having an ICC arrest warrant hanging over his head.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. Now the US cannot tell that Putin is also visiting India, and that is there is an arrest warrant and all those things. But we'll touch with about this whole Putin-Trump meet tomorrow, if I understand. But before that, I want to understand this whole Trump-India. India's stance is about Do you think whatever happens tomorrow, but over the last few years, especially a couple of decades, the whole feeling was that India and US are natural allies, both being democracy, and they have a long way to go. Do you think this sort of a atmosphere will lead to a feeling among a lot of people in India that US cannot be trusted in any manner, because any president will come and try to put it. Already in Indian psyche there is this whole, Russian support, USSR support long back in 1971 war, that US Russia can be trusted. They have been with us, but US cannot be, in spite of whatever commonality between the two countries. How do you see that? Has Trump already caused a major damage in the long term vision? Also, if India is moving more towards Russia and also probably China, then where does US China fight take, work without presence of India? Has US already, worked that out? Or do they think that India is something very easy? They can always get back, on their side whenever they want to.
To be sure, Trump is doing a lot of damage for the U.S. image, for its relationships, for its economic opportunities now, and long-term calculations later as well. And it's not going to be easy to fix. That said, I think many in India, and especially its government, and understand that the U.S. is more than just Donald Trump, who is a relatively new occurrence in the U.S. political scene, and he is not eternal. His term will end, and with with that, a lot of his the trends around him will also end. Even if he continues to dominate the Republican Party, there's a good chance that other players will replace the current cadre of loyalists and bring back alternative proposals into U.S. body politics. I think it's um, I think it's very clear that Trump and his close circle have tried to consolidate power very quickly by uh, gaining control of US institutions, but that doesn't mean that they have an absolute support on a popular level. Certainly not among people who are losing their jobs as a result of that in the United States. And let's face it, while this may be costing India some economic opportunities, it is costing Americans literal money and jobs and businesses. So it's hitting US as hard as it is hitting India, and people who voted for Trump may not continue to support such people with such policies in the future once they start feeling the impact. Another issue to remember is that uh, on the that there's many economists and people outside the MAGA circles who have been very critical of these developments and have been warning about the repercussions, which clearly signals to everyone, including India, that there's a lot of people who are not accepting this policy. They understand the impact, and therefore they can be relied on to continue the relations and to provide better advice to future presidents. Let's face it, Trump has never been a geopolitical expert. He has been a showman, a failed businessman, an opportunist for many years. But what he has not been is someone deeply immersed in the sphere, and neither are most people around him. None of them are um, really stars in the field of politics and geopolitics, and so they're not necessarily representative of all there is in the US political sphere. They're not even the best of the worst necessarily. They're simply loyalist to Trump, and as soon as he and his impact diminishes, this sort of people is unlikely to make a long-term political comeback, even if they make a lot of damage in the short term. I think
Absolutely.
I think eventually, once people actually start seeing the impact, many of them will start waking up and looking for other opportunities. The whole thing with Russia as well, I think even many Republicans are already critical of everything that's going on. They're certainly not admirers of Witkov or his unprofessional approach to and his business conflicts of interest in Russia and other countries. So I think that too we are going to see a lot of changes if Congress, for instance, if there is a blue wave next year, for instance, even many of the current Republicans are planning to retire early, which signals that they're not agree fully in agreement with the current course of action. That's a message to the administration, and it's a very clear message. Trump may be in control of a lot of things, but not of everything.
Absolutely, absolutely. So now coming back to this whole Alaska meeting between Putin and Trump means, if I understand, use the word called, we want to get feel of everything. What feel of everything, Irina? Means, weren't those 90-minute calls, 120 minutes calls, several of them, enough to get a feel of everything, or even Putin's mind? Help us understand. Is this a pure waste of it? What is it about? It's about Ukraine not being there. How do you get a feel of things in international diplomacy, Irina? Help us understand from that point of view.
Well, Ukraine is firmly rejecting any land for peace proposal. First, because it's unconstitutional. So for Zelensky, it would be political suicide to act against the law. It's also extremely unpopular. There's a growing number of people who are tired of the war and are willing to settle at any cost. But at the end of the day, most people understand that it would be suicidal for them. Russia has shown willingness to commit atrocities. They have abducted over 700,000 people from Ukraine. Some are involved in slave labor, others are imprisoned, some are sent to the front lines as and forced to fight against their own countrymen. And at least 22,000 of these people have been identified as minors, as children, who've also suffered all sorts of horrific fates. That is not something that Ukrainians can easily just forget about. This is not some minor territorial dispute over unclear borders like it's between Thailand and Cambodia, where the issues are far less fraught, far less bloody, and even there they involved a fair amount of politicking and violence. And for Ukraine, this is not only an issue of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, it is now an existential issue, particularly after Russian media essentially called for everyone in Ukraine to be killed. This is a statement of genocidal intent, a very clear one, and it has not been disputed by anyone, and it has not been recalled or cancelled by anyone. There was no apology. There was a very clear message approved by the Kremlin. Something like that does not go out without official approval. So we are seeing that Ukraine is essentially cornered into doing whatever it needs to defend itself, no matter whether Europe or the United States or anyone else steps up to the plate and assists them in that matter. The other alternative is waiting to be slaughtered, enslaved, and turned into another failed colony of Russia. We have seen what they've done in Chechnya over the course of 2 wars and the consequences. Crimea used to be a flourishing resort area, is now suffering horrific economic duress as a result of the conquest. The locals have been deprived of the basics. Some of them have been threatened, and others have been misled into supporting Russia at the referendum, and the consequences have been dire. It's an example for why no one should want Russia involved in their country. So all of that, that is to say, that Russia too is not a trustworthy player, as much as India may have concerns about Donald Trump and the general unpredictability of US politics. What we are seeing in Russia is that it has a predictable line, but that is not a good line to have. It has been predictably authoritarian, predictably meddlesome, and predictably self-interested in a way that's imperialist rather than oriented towards economic prosperity or cooperation. We have also seen a very clear line of Russia meddling in Indian affairs just as much, but covertly, and specifically in favor of radical left-wing parties and anti-nationalist parties, because, as I said, a split with the US serves Russia's goals very well. Let's not forget that Russia is in a close and growing alliance with China, and so its calculus is also to help its ally and partner not only to just continue its historic relationship with India. And for that reason, Prime Minister Modi and his party are not necessarily the favored political entity for Russia in India. They may be looking to cause problems and to create a chaotic environment just to have more control over Indian affairs. And I think everyone in India who is currently celebrating that relationship should be well aware of where it's actually all going.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. So from Alaska, let's go very close to India, that is Pakistan. Pakistan, Trump is looking for oil, and Pakistanis also perhaps are a bit surprised about this. Where do you think this oil is? Is it in Balochistan? Is it somewhere else? Near the general's house, or I don't know. Where is it? Will finding Pakistani oil will be as difficult to find Osama bin Laden or oil will be a much more difficult game. Tell us, Irina.
Well, historically, Pakistan's role in U.S. energy security discussion has been peripheral. The biggest project that Pakistan could have been involved in was the TAPI, the pipeline that actually crisscrossed Afghanistan and which never has not come to fruition despite theoretical U.S. approval. That was as close as it got. Um, Pakistan is not known to be an oil powerhouse like Saudi Arabia, UAE, but Trump is looking for unconventional opportunities to make a deal, looking beyond traditional suppliers, perhaps as part of a broader push to secure politically flexible sources of crude. Now, the surprise stems partly from this mismatch between its rather modest proven reserves and the scale of US demand. Islamabad's petroleum sector is underdeveloped. The exploration projects are often slowed by bureaucratic hurdles, inconsistent regulatory regimes, and security concerns in key producing regions such as Balochistan, which is increasingly restive and has always been volatile but has become even more so in recent years. Um, Trump's interests uh, could be interpreted or perhaps misinterpreted as a signal of potential U.S. investment or technological assistance to unlock untapped reserves. Alternatively, it could just be Trump saying whatever came to his mind at that particular moment. The geopolitical ramifications, if in fact he's seriously considering this policy, would be quite significant. Pakistan oil potential has been courted in the past primarily by China under the framework of the CPEC, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. If Washington enters the space with capital and expertise, it could disrupt Beijing's near monopoly over Pakistan's strategic infrastructure development. And that would be, in theory, consistent with Trump's preference for transactional, deal oriented diplomacy that also shifts the strategic balance. It could provide Pakistan an out of its extremely heavy economic dependence on China. Well, Pakistan's reaction so far has been measured by cautious. While the idea of attracting large scale US energy investment is certainly appealing, it comes with political strings that the current leadership might not be ready to accept and probably isn't. Any alignment with Washington's energy security agenda would risk antagonizing China, but with no guarantees from Trump. And China remains Pakistan's most reliable partner in both defense and infrastructure development. Moreover, US has had a very complicated relationship with Pakistan for a very long time over counterterrorism, nuclear proliferation, and governance. Introducing energy cooperation into this mix could create opportunities for improved relations, but it could also serve as a new arena for strategic mistrust if either country sees the other as exploiting the arrangement for leverage. Now, the Trump administration could be eyeing Afghanistan and Iran. As Pakistan becomes more deeply integrated into US energy networks, it could, in theory, serve as a counterweight to Iranian influence in the region. create a logistical corridor for US commerce, and for strategic interests into Central Asia. But such positioning would place Pakistan at the center of intense geopolitical competition with all the risks attached, and key of them being its close security cooperation with Iran that many people are not aware of. Many factions in Pakistan are extremely closely coordinating with Iran, and that has only grown over time. And I'm not sure that Pakistan would be ready to abandon its old partner over a resurgent and potentially flighty US interest into a very limited scope. Now, that a US oil investment could also become a divisive issue for Pakistan domestically. Nationalists would likely frame it as a compromise of sovereignty. Reformists, not that there are too many of those really, would claim that it's necessary to modernize the country's energy sector and to stabilize its economy. The current fragile coalition government would have a great deal of trouble navigating these competing narratives successfully. Then there's also the issue of feasibility. Pakistan's infrastructure requires massive upgrades to handle exports on a scale that would interest Washington. Ports, pipelines, refineries all need modernization, security arrangements in volatile regions, and all of that must be robust enough to assure US investors and policymakers. From DC's perspective, even if the direct energy gains from Pakistan are modest, the geopolitical dividends could be substantial. US is looking to diversify away from Middle Eastern suppliers, reduce vulnerability to disruptions in the Gulf, and create new levers of influence in South Asia. Trump's team likely sees it as a low cost, high symbolism move. But the viability of this idea ultimately hinges on whether Trump's remarks are followed by concrete policy steps. If the administration dispatches energy envoys, proposes feasibility studies, offers financing for exploration projects, Pakistan and the rest of the world will know that the offer is serious. Otherwise, it may remain yet another example of Trumpian improvisation. Briefly intriguing, strategically provocative, but ultimately unrealized.
Absolutely, absolutely, Irina. How do you think China will be looking at this? Will they let Pakistan play this game because it's Trump is there only for a few years and then it will be back to old partners? Because Chinese leadership is there for quite some time. How would they be? Will they play along, let Pakistan gain whatever benefits they can get, and then it will be back to in China-Pakistan friendship?
Well, I think China is certainly watching carefully what happens. It would not be happy about having US re-enter its sphere of influence, and it would probably try to push back if it ever got to that point far enough. But I also think it's very cautious not to overreact at very early stages because, as we have seen many times, Trump says a great many things. He spits out ideas and then nothing happens. His idea of, for instance, turning the museum of Alcatraz back into a functioning prison may have been one of those instances. I think this could be another similar example. So for China, it would be more of a risk to react right now than to wait and see what happens. I doubt, in any case, that this oil exploration is a high priority given everything else that is going on in the world at the moment.
Absolutely. From a general Pakistani point of view, should they be happy or should they be a bit sad? Because China is now a bit distant, and then it looks like to be more of Trump's personal venture. He sent his son's friends down to look at things down in Pakistan, and all those ventures, 60% stake in another company. I'm trying. There were some media reports. I'm trying to understand: is Trump looking at things beyond his tenure, not as the president, but also Trump, the businessman? How should a general Pakistani look? Because look at it, Trump will be gone as the president in the next 3 years. Plus, should they be happy? Should they have any much more, hope for the future from this sort of a thing? that all the country's problems will be gone. What about Imran Khan? Trump is also batting for him. So will he bat for the general, the field marshal, or will it bat for Imran Khan if he is free? What does he want? Who will he choose out of these two?
Well, as I mentioned, the current coalition is very fragile, so any serious interference could bring the government to a collapse, and then it's anyone guess what happens. And Trump could propose a major deal with Pakistan in exchange for the release of Imran Khan and his return to politics. Now, there are some, even in the current government, who believe it is advantageous to restore strategic ties with the United States, and they see it as advantageous for various reasons. One of which is that they think that great power competition benefits small and mid-sized countries and helps them play the two against each other and gain economic and political advantage out of that intrigue. There is more to the story, though. Without a question, Trump is acting as a businessman as much as U.S. president, because his organization has never, as I said, he has never fully divested from it personally, and his sons are running the show on his behalf with his very active approval and involvement. His son's partner, Umar Malik, is half Pakistani, and he works for a Qatari company right now. So there is another angle to all this, which is that Trump may be thinking about an even bigger picture, which is the connection between Gulf countries and Pakistan and what he can gain from that. Now, as much as there are pro-Iranian factions in Pakistan, the Gulf states have at least as much, if not more, influence, and there are sectors of the defense that are closely connected to Saudi Arabia in particular, although lately UAE and Qatar have been exploring economic corridors for strategic reasons and investing into various types of infrastructure as well. All of that signals to Pakistan potential opportunities that may not come from geopolitics per se, but may come from business and also from expanded geopolitics related to these Gulf opportunities. Now, Trump's sons have been going all over the Gulf, basically signing deals that have nothing to do with the official deals signed by the United States with those three countries. And we can see that this potential new venture is an extension to this empire that they have been creating with particular interest in Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. That's not to say that in Saudi everybody is entirely on board with everything that's going on, but there is enough of key figures and operatives and business people who find this idea interesting, at least in the short term, which might all that might be necessary to make enough money to live very comfortably. Let's face it, oil is big business. So what we are seeing is a potential economic investment for sure, but let's face it, who will benefit from it? It won't be the average Pakistani, sad to say, much as they're not really benefiting from most of the things happening right now, except maybe on the level of startups and entirely grassroots initiatives of the sort that are not dependent on government involvement, and where government just needs to give some space. Everything else is basically still controlled by the military, poorly controlled, I might say, but enough that it chokes down the private sector. And the energy sector is for sure one of those spheres. The deals that the Trump organization signs is usually with top companies and governments, not with small not with the small or mid-sized businesses. So this will not be benefiting the broad population and the broad business sphere. In Pakistan, only the usual suspects, as is the case with most of what Trump is doing, whether on behalf of the U.S. government or on behalf of the Trump organization. I would not get my hopes high that it will somehow save Pakistan from economic ruin. It will just help stuff the pockets of the same people who are already in power or have been in power at one point.
Absolutely, absolutely. If I remember, at one point in time, uh, Trump accused Joe Biden of, giving him this presidential pardon, if I remember correctly, and now it is his own family that is business that is coming in the forefront. Lots of talks about that. Be that as it may, there is a lot of talk about Nobel Peace Prize aspirations of Mr. Donald Trump, and if I reports say that he has been nominated for the 2026 Nobel Peace Prize. If have you read those reports? Is it true?
Yes, there's
Do you
been
how
more.
does how does it look like? Pakistan seems to have found lots of love for Donald Trump.
Oh, it's been more than Pakistan now. Thailand and Cambodia have apparently nominated him for that, and Azerbaijan and Armenia are potentially uh, either going to join some of the other countries or do their own nomination. Not sure what's going to happen. And of course, Netanyahu of Israel did his own nomination, although that may actually end up doing more harm than good to Donald Trump's chances. But what we are seeing is that he has four current nominations pending, or three or four, depending on whether Azerbaijan and Armenia go through with it, and one by one Ukrainian official that has been pulled as a result of Trump's continued volatile and largely pro-Russian politics. So there's been people who realize that uh, just to please Trump, they will nominate to get his goodwill, even if he does not ultimately get anything. And none of these people can control the process, which is decided entirely in Norway, and frankly, is very unlikely to pan out. But from the point of strategic influence, it's a smart move, for whoever is doing it, because they understand that it immediately gains them Trump's goodwill, at least temporarily.
Absolutely, absolutely. A lot of states which have had conflicts in the very recent past, they have all nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. Very nice way of looking at the way international politics and affairs are going on. Be that as it may, let's come down to another place of conflict. Talked about Netanyahu. Let's talk about Israel, about Gaza. What's happening in there? How should we look at? Uh, we have always been talking about peace, but now we are not talking about peace. It's talking about perhaps much more conflict there in that part of the world. How does it look like, Aydin?
Well, Israel has doubled down on its announcement that it will be liberating Gaza from Hamas and urged the civilians in Gaza City to evacuate by October 7th, uh, which would uh, which would be the time Israel would intensify its military campaign and fully occupy the remainder of the territory. Uh, According to Netanyahu, the goal is to release the hostages, to dismantle Hamas's operational infrastructure decisively, and to find a path towards a new leadership in Gaza. Now, that is somewhat contradictory messaging. First of all, there's a good chance that if hostages are not released by then, they could die as a result of the assaults or just be killed by Hamas as the last remaining leverage falls apart. Um, Netanyahu also had suggested that while Gaza would be occupied, it would be a temporary measure, and he would then turn over Gaza to the Arab security forces. The problem with that statement, of course, is that no Arab country has volunteered to take on that role, and I wonder why. Nobody seems to want Gaza. Everybody wants to talk about Gaza. Everybody wants to send, aid to Gaza. Everybody wants to use Gaza as a political talking point, but nobody wants to govern or even to securitize it in any substantive way. So I'm not entirely sure where all of the, where who will ultimately control the territory. Yali is allegedly proposing a Palestinian candidate for that position, but whether he has any credibility with the locals enough to survive the inevitable factional struggle inside the territory is extremely questionable at best. The other issue that's happening simultaneously and that seems to contradict this plan is that Israel has been allegedly in talks with various African and Asian countries to take in volunteer Palestinians who would leave Gaza during the offensive to relocate them temporarily or permanently. South Sudan being the latest such candidate, an exceptionally bizarre proposition given that it's coming out of major conflicts, that it has assorted governance and development issues, that it's a largely Christian population, primarily black, that does not particularly get has have a good history of getting along with Arab tribes locally. Gazans are not only Muslim, with a small exception of Christians remaining there, but they are not known for their good relations with black communities, shall we say, and they're also most of them are frankly radicalized. That's the crux of the problem with why no one wants to govern Gaza, and this would not necessarily be a good combination unless we're talking about a very small number that is well vetted and can be easily integrated somewhere where there won't be much of a cultural shock to anyone. But a far more pressing issue is that these negotiations are taking place without anyone's agreement to this measure, not by the Gazans themselves, not by Egyptians who would need to process all these people, and not by any maritime authorities, given that, again, whoever does decide to leave Gaza or would need to have a way to get to South Sudan or Libya or whatever other country that is ultimately designated, and it doesn't sound like there are many takers at the moment. So this logistical challenge, it seems to be that Israel once again is putting the carriage before the horse. Perhaps the idea is to create momentum to 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 push the Gazans to consider this possibility, to push Trump or the Arab countries to do something rather than simply watching from the sidelines, to start the discussion, to create some sort of a decision-making mechanism. But whatever it is, it's not really working. We're not seeing this any sort of serious follow-up to that, and it looks kind of ridiculous given that Hamas is still largely in charge. It has been losing ground, but none of the security issues have been resolved, and Israel is not yet in the control of Gaza. So some of this could literally be extremely premature at best, and it doesn't look serious right now. And it's a very strange idea that will likely inspire a lot of backlash at Israel in the media and among pro Palestinian activists without any real support outside some conservative American and European Jewish communities, and some maybe Christian groups who might think it's a good measure to de-radicalize Gaza. I don't know, but these ideas are contradictory. They're not well thought out. They seem to be rhetorical. It doesn't seem like Israel is allocating resources to a serious occupation, which may not be as short as Netanyahu proclaims. In fact, no clear timeline is indicated, so nobody knows what short actually means. But what we do know is no matter how long it will ultimately take, you need a serious surge of personnel to have a permanent presence with rotations allotted. You need an allocation of financial resources. You need equipment and materials, and I'm not seeing any of that actually happening. What I am seeing is infighting between the prime minister and the chief of the military, the chief of staff of the military, who thinks that this strategy is going to backfire and does not back it. This plan was approved, but it's scarce on details and seems to be either something that they will fill, the details will be filled out later, or it could be that, like, the current strategy in Gaza meander until uh, it somehow manages to decide itself along the way. Either way, there's a lot more questions than answers at this point.
Absolutely. And what about Germany freezing, arms sales to Israel? Why is that happening? And Israel has threatened to cut intelligence sharing ties with UK. What's happening on the diplomatic front outside Israel?
Now, let's face it, this decision didn't come in a vacuum, although it did come as a result of a split and a polarization inside Germany's political circles. Several things happened simultaneously. First, several other Western countries said they would be recognizing a state of Palestine, in theory, essentially to put pressure on Israel to do something and to mm, uh, solve the alleged humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and to put pressure on Israel to do more to facilitate the deliveries of goods. Some of it was a result of misinformation, some of it was a result of miscommunication, some of it was a result of political desperation by some of these leaders. But for Germany, the last straw in all of this was Israel's reaction, likely Israel's reaction to a comment made by Merz, uh, where he didn't push for creation of the state of Palestine, but he did criticize Israel for the way it's handling the humanitarian issues in Gaza, and essentially that resulted in a public diplomatic rebuke by Israel. And I think Merz, in reaction to that, agreed to freeze the arms that he said would be used could be used in Gaza. Germany is Israel's second largest supplier of weapons after the US. So this is not like UK, where the impact of such a measure would actually be minimal and has been minimal. This is actually a very serious concern, practically speaking, and it signals once again a growing diplomatic divergence among European partners regarding the Gaza operation. Um, Berlin's decision reflects both domestic political pressures and broader European concerns about proportionality, civilian casualties, humanitarian dimensions, and generally lack of strategy and lack of consensus, and Israel's lack of clear communication with the European partners about this issue, all of which are absolutely true. Now, that's not to say that these measures are either effective, other than boosting Netanyahu's otherwise crashing popularity, or that they're in any way helpful either to Gaza or to the resolution of the conflict. I would say that they are not. Um, Israel, meanwhile, threatened to curtail intelligence sharing with the UK, which also represents a significant pivot now in security cooperation. London has historically benefited from Israeli intelligence on regional terrorism, Hamas operation, and Iranian activities. A disruption could create operational gaps affecting counterterrorism efforts across Europe and the Middle East. And by the way, UK has also been a strong partner in some of these intelligence operations with Israel and the United States, especially in Iran, in uncovering various nuclear facilities. UK was also part of the US-led defense coalition engaged in defensive air defense against Iranian missiles in the Middle East, missiles and drones aimed at Israel during the last war and other previous incidents. The dispute illustrates how operational decisions on one front can ripple through alliances. So we are seeing that there is almost a domino effect of these Western leaders, France, Netherlands, Canada, Australia, UK, and Germany. Domestic politics in those countries, coalition sensitivities, and public opinion. They all intersect with Israel's strategic calculus, and they're highlighting the growing fragility of traditional Western alignments when military operations provoke moral, ethical, and security and strategic concerns abroad. I mean, again, a lot of it may be as a result of disinformation, it may be a result of domestic pressures by particular constituencies, but none of it takes away from the fact that Israel has not been able to articulate its own position and its interests and its desirable outcome in a clear, convincing, and coherent way. Those three C's are important in strategic communication, and for Israel, strategic communication, which is generally a central part of successful management of a conflict, it's been missing from the equation, and we're seeing the fallout from that. Now, Israel's posture emphasizes sovereignty and security imperatives. Jerusalem perceives any restriction on military capability or intelligence as a direct threat to national survival. By linking arms and intelligence to political alignment, Israel is communicating both deterrence and expectation of unconditional support from allies in high stakes operations. The UK is caught between supporting Israel and upholding domestic standards, European demands, and it's facing a complex dilemma. This requires a nuanced balance with potential consequences for broader security cooperation, NATO cohesion, and regional operation targeting non-state actors. All of that is coming into play, and frankly, the leaders of the current group of people have been extremely clumsy in handling the public diplomacy in that regard on their own end. Again, there's a lot to criticize Israel for, but I don't think their approach has been particularly effective or convincing, and some of their foreign ministers have had to back away from some of their comments, especially after Hamas celebrated some of these announcements, not an effect that anyone should have intended, even if these comments came with caveats of wanting to get Hamas out of there. Let's face it, none of these countries are contributing anything to directly disenfranchise Hamas and to get it out of Gaza. They are mostly talking, and some of them have not been particularly even enforcing sanctions against Hamas in their own countries. So there's also a lot of domestic blowback on that level as well. Now, Germany's freeze also reflects strategic caution, um, signaling to both Israel and to other regional actors that European states are attentive to civilian harm. So, what am I talking about? Is Germany so convinced by Hamas propaganda? I'm not entirely sure that Hamas is the only active um, player here. I think Arab states and their concerns play as much of a role in German calculus and probably a lot more. And this is something that Israel cannot just as easily offset, because Israel's communications with those countries has not been the best other than on purely tactical matters and the broader agreement that Hamas needs to leave. That's been a major move, but I'm not sure that it's been necessarily sparked by anything Israel has done, as by the fact that Hamas has become increasingly destructive, out of hand, uncontrollable, aggressive, and chaotic in its own actions and operations, and has created a very visible threat, public threat to these states, and a threat of destabilization. In terms of strategic coordination, that's been on and off, and there's been also unrelated diplomatic problems, such as the dismissal of the Israeli ambassador to UE after a sexual harassment scandal at a local bar. All of these things have not been particularly helpful to Israel's position, aside from the widespread Hamas propaganda and Israel's inability to handle the information warfare effectively. Diplomatic channels, of course, are already being activated. This is inevitable. All the countries involved will engage in high level negotiations to de escalate tensions. Behind the scenes diplomacy will likely involve reassurance measures, phased arms reapprovals, and possibly increased coordination on humanitarian aid to mitigate public and political backlash. But all of that will take time. And in the meantime, the daylight between Europe and Canada, Australia, and the Israel Israelis that we're seeing right now, and also U.S. has been siding with Israel on this issue, but also increasingly critical in various comments from Trump, Ambassador Huckabee, and other players. All of that signals uh, that Hamas has a room to maneuver and to play on these apparent political divisions, and it has been doing so effectively, mobilizing sympathetic populations in those countries and trying to kind of stir up this firestorm. And unfortunately, Israel has been falling into the trap of allowing that to happen as well. Beyond Europe, US has to consider the implications for NATO cohesion, intelligence sharing frameworks, and its own strategic support for Israel. It could try to act as a mediator, but its own relationship with many of these capitals is strained. J.D. Vance's recent ongoing trip to UK, where he's been attacking UK for its alleged lack of democracy, may not be helpful at this current time. It could also try to encourage compromise to prevent widening rifts exploited by assorted adversaries. Operationally, Israel could accelerate domestic production of critical systems and try to search for alternative suppliers, perhaps become more dependent on the US. This would have long-term implications for European defense experts, shifting procurement patterns, and for new partnerships outside traditional Western channels. Relationships with Japan and India could become more crucial, for instance, and more pronounced. And of course, strategic necessity versus allegations of ethical responsibility come into play. Alliance obligations, accountability, national security imperatives, and information warfare are all being juggled with various degrees of success by all of these players, and it's not an easy combination to follow.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's so much happening out there. Our last topic of the day, Irina, is about MBS. Is MBS visiting Washington in November? There's this report, but nobody is talking about it. Nobody is commenting on that. And why is it visit? If at all it is happening, why is it so important?
Now, first of all, this notice came up in only one article so far, Bloomberg, but it's an important indication of the seriousness of introduction of the topic, because Bloomberg is one of the outlets for official, unofficial leaks from Saudi Arabia concerning important political issues. So if something is published there, there's a fair degree of signaling that something is going on, or at least being considered. Now, the phrasing was careful. It said that this may happen, that the crown prince is considering this trip. Of course, it could be unconsidered for any number of logistical issues. Trump himself has not commented on this topic. Um, and let's face it, Trump has not invited the crown prince during his last visit to Saudi Arabia, which was noted by a few analysts, and which has been uh, rather, jarring in light of the noise and high degree of coverage that trip has otherwise gotten. So it seems to be that the Saudis are trying to push for a basically top level meeting and seeing whether the US would be open to that possibility. Trump so far has been admittedly distracted by other matters, such as the deals with Russia, the situation in Gaza, and other minor and large occurrences. So it may be a matter of time before US officially makes an announcement, if there's any announcement to make. However, there's several ways to interpret the overall silence. First, one could always write it off as something that the stakeholders view this visit as routine, despite high-profile conduct surrounding regional conflicts and economic negotiations. This perception would underscore a level of predictability in US-Saudi relations, even amidst turbulence elsewhere. The reality is, however, that would be anything but true. That is decidedly not the case. MBS has not been in the United States since 2018, his first extremely high profile introductory visit. Lots of publicity, lots of propaganda from Qataris. This was in the middle of the Gulf crisis of 2017 that went on for 4 years. So the fact that no one, even the Qataris who publicly improved relations with Saudi Arabia, but have continued some of these anti-MBS campaigns through other means, the fact that there's dead silence about it, first is it may be that the visit is extremely speculative and may not happen. It could also be that there's almost a concerted effort not to bring attention to it for whatever reason. But to say that it's something routine is definitely not. Part of the reason that MBS has not come to the United States was that during Trump's term after the Khashoggi scandal, the U.S. Congress came out with a couple of resolutions blaming him for Khashoggi's death, which effectively amounts to a persona non grata status. Not so much because only the State Department can actually impose that, but it communicates awkwardness in relations. The Biden administration had horrible relations with Saudi Arabia in general and with the MBS specifically, so that visit was not going to happen. And Trump failed to invite MBS officially, so the fact that this is being pushed seems to indicate an importance of trying to get back into a level of relationship where a reciprocal high level visit is possible. Otherwise, US would be seen as disproportionately having a one-way influence over Saudi Arabia and not having the same level of reciprocity. If anything, this the fact that this is being floated is indicates concern about US-Saudi relations on some level. And of course, there's this question of seeing how the public reaction to MBS committee would happen. But the reality is, on the surface, there doesn't seem to be anything urgent that needs to be addressed that hasn't already been addressed during Trump's visit or through lower level channels so far. Yes, there's a lot of issues that are being discussed, from Russia Ukraine conflict to Gaza to Iran, to US discussions to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, to various assorted economic and energy agendas. All of these issues are important, but are they necessary for a high-level visit in an urgent way? No. So there might be something else going on behind the scenes, and the fact that this context is so strange is really concerning. Now, what would the public discussions that would take place if that were to happen are fairly predictable. Um, there is a push by Saudi Arabia to continue promoting Vision 2030, even as some of the public projects stumble due to economic issues in Saudi Arabia. It has had to scale back projects like NEOM and the Line and others. And it seems to me that some of the projects initiated or officially announced by MBS are now being handled by other people, and uh, the invest whatever the investors are in the United States, they may want to figure out and recalculate their role in some of these projects. But of course, besides these infrastructure gimmicks, energy security, oil production management, investment cooperation overall, joint regional initiatives, and the strengthening bilateral economic ties, they're always going to be part of a visit of that sort. Yemen, Iran, broader Gulf security architecture would also be high on the agenda, with the hope of getting US assurances on cooperative measures designed to stabilize world theaters. Now, the Houthis have resumed their threats to Saudi Arabia. US has not been able to manage the trade disruptions. So, Saudi Arabia could become a target once again anytime. And of course, the Israel Iran span could have indirect impact on Saudi security as well, with the Iranian missiles flying in that general direction in the past. Not something directly involving Saudi, but we have seen Saudi Arabia engage with Iran on the top defense level, including right after those incidents, and on top political level as well, which again indicates that there is interest within Saudi Arabia looking to kind of take advantage of these openings to avoid confrontations and to um, keep these relationships afloat, despite the fact that no one really trusts Iran. Um, for
Absolutely.
Riyadh, this visit uh, would signal continuity in strategic alignment in an effort to fix any issues. It uh, it may be positive in reinforcing MBS's image both domestically and regionally as an active and recognized global leader capable of navigating complex economic and security dialogue. But Washington's muted response may reflect calculated optics. um, they may want to be avoiding, a controversy related to potential discussion. It could also be a message to Riyadh, a message of, if we are thinking about it, a message we'll get back to you later because right now this is not as urgent as other things. The message is we don't need to make big deal out of it. All the big issues are already being handled, so we can get discuss it anytime. Or the message could be we are not that excited about this. Any of those things could be true, and time will tell which one of these options Trump and his team are trying to communicate. There is a potential to use this visit as an avenue for quiet diplomacy on some of the controversies and contentious issues. Um, but it could also be that the reason the media has not been reacting is it's been distracted with conflicts. It may no longer see MBS as a novelty, or it may be deliberately not trying to not highlight his visit here as a way of communicating indirect negative reaction. Any of those things could also be true as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.